On most mornings in Providence Municipal Court, parking tickets shuffled past like pages in an old phone book. But the moment this woman called her fine a joke, even the court stenographer stopped typing and looked up. The room had that familiar, tired rhythm. Someone in the back cleared his throat and tried to make it quiet. A ballpoint pen tapped against a clipboard, steady as a clock. The court officer by the door eased it shut so gently the latch barely clicked. The hum of the old air conditioner filled the gaps between names and case numbers. Routine. Predictable. The kind of small city morning people forget by lunch. Then, the clerk called her name. Helena Farrow. Her heels announced her before she reached the microphone. Sharp, unhurried taps on the linoleum that refused to blend into the background. She didn't glance toward the bench or the flag behind it. Her eyes stayed on the glow of her phone, thumb moving, chin slightly raised, as if she were standing in a hotel lobby and someone was late bringing her car around. When she reached the defendant's spot, she dropped a large handbag onto the table beside her with a flat thud, like she was claiming territory. The strap slid, almost pushing the citation aside. She didn't straighten the paper. She didn't even look at it. She just leaned slightly on one hip, chewing gum slowly, jaw working in a rhythm that ignored the room entirely. Behind her, a couple on the bench traded a glance. An older man in a worn jacket shifted, eyebrows lifting. No one said a word, but the air changed, the way it does when someone walks into a church still talking on a phone. Judge Caprio glanced down at the file, then back up at her. "Good morning, Mrs. Farrow," he said, voice even. "You're here on a parking violation. Parking in a space reserved for individuals with disabilities. The scheduled fine is $100. He might as well have read out the weather. Helena let out a short, amused breath, half laugh, half scoff. She finally looked up at the bench, but not with curiosity, with the bored impatience of someone waiting for a server to bring the check. $100? She repeated, as if confirming she'd heard right. The corner of her mouth lifted. That's not even what I pay for my manicure. Honestly, it's ridiculous. A few heads turned. Someone in the second row let out a low, disbelieving before catching himself. The clerk's pen stopped tapping. The room, which had spent all morning half asleep, was suddenly wide awake. Judge Caprio's eyes lifted fully now, studying her over his glasses. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mrs. Farrow," he said slowly, "tell me, why were you parked in that particular spot?" She shifted, finally taking the phone out of her hand and placing it face down beside the bag. The gum clicked once between her teeth. "There was a reason," she said with a small shrug. "But that's my business." For a moment, the only sound was the faint whir of the ceiling vent and the scratch of someone's shoe on the floor. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. There was something held back, something she didn't want in the record. The judge leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. "Mrs. Farrow," he replied, his voice still calm but carrying to the back row. "In this courtroom, everything connected to that parking space is my business." He let that hang in the silence between them, and the whole room seemed to lean in with him. Judge Caprio didn't press immediately. He waited, long enough for the tension to settle, not long enough to let her regain control. "Mrs. Farrow," he said, gentler now, "before we go further, tell me a little about what you do." She exhaled through her nose, the kind of breath meant to signal inconvenience. "I help my husband with the business," she answered. "Gas stations, all over the state." "And you're a co-owner?" the judge asked. Her jaw paused mid-chew. A tiny hesitation, barely a heartbeat, but enough for everyone to catch. "You could say that," she replied, adding a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. It wasn't the answer of a woman comfortable with the truth, more like someone trying to keep a lid on a pot already rattling. Judge Caprio looked down at the sheet in front of him, then back at her. "This isn't the first time you've appeared in Providence Court," he said. "Not accusing, just factual. It seems you've had several parking issues. I recall something last year?" Her shoulders stiffened. "I don't remember," she muttered. But the judge wasn't referencing the past to shame her. He was mapping a pattern. And the room, especially the older men and women in the benches, recognized that tone. The tone of someone piecing a puzzle together. "You understand?" he continued. "When someone has repeated issues, the circumstances matter." She looked away, eyes landing on some vague spot near the flag, as if the threads of the conversation were slipping out of her grasp. He asked softly, "What made today so different? Why were you in such a hurry?" Her answer came too quickly, too sharp. "I had things to take care of. Family things." Something in that reply cracked. Not visibly, not dramatically, but the sound of it was there for anyone paying close attention. A brief tremor in her voice, quickly smothered. The judge didn't exploit it. That wasn't his way. "Family matters can be difficult," he said, voice steady as a hand on a shoulder. "But they don't usually lead someone to ignore a disability sign." She swallowed, the gum forgotten for a moment. "I said I was in a hurry, and I'm asking why." Her fingers brushed the edge of her phone, restless. "I don't need to explain every detail of my morning," she replied, but the defiance had thinned. Something underneath it, fatigue, worry, began to leak through the cracks in her posture. The courtroom felt it. Human frailty has a different texture than arrogance. Less sharp, more hollow. Judge Caprio gave her space to continue, and after a few seconds, she layered on a reason, too quickly, like someone patching a sinking boat. "I've been in hospitals all week," she blurted. "That's why. I'm exhausted. I'm trying to deal with things." The words hung there, oddly shaped, not fitting the earlier confidence. The judge watched her closely. "In hospitals?" he repeated. "With whom?" She blinked, startled by her own slip. "That's personal," she said, this time more guarded than proud. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was curious. People leaned forward slightly, sensing that whatever she was hiding wasn't trivial. She had come in chewing gum, face lit by the glow of her phone, tossing off a fine-like spare change. But now something shifted in her, a waver she clearly didn't expect to reveal. The judge didn't push further, not yet. He simply set the file aside, folding his hands again as if preparing for a different conversation entirely. "Mrs. Farrow," he said quietly, "when someone mentions hospitals, that changes the nature of things." Her throat moved in a tight swallow. She didn't speak. And the room, once irritated by her arrogance, now sensed something more complicated taking shape. A story they hadn't been told yet, one she seemed frightened to reveal. The calm before the storm tightened, one quiet breath at a time. Judge Caprio let the silence breathe just long enough for it to become unmistakable. Then he leaned back slightly and asked, in the same measured voice, "Mrs. Farrow, was your visit to the hospital connected to why you parked in that space reserved for the disabled?" The question hit her like a flick of cold water. She gave a short, brittle laugh, too loud for the room, too defensive to hide anything. "You don't have the right to dig into my private life," she snapped. "You mentioned the hospital yourself," the judge replied calmly. And then, nothing. A stillness so complete, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights became audible. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unable to decide what to reveal. The judge glanced down at the file. "You said earlier you were rushing to a meeting." "That's not what I said," she shot back. He looked up, unshaken. "You did? And the court recorder captured it." A flush moved along her cheekbones, the first sign that she understood she'd contradicted herself. More than arrogance now. She was cornered by her own words. Before the judge could continue, movement stirred in the back row. A slow rise, almost hesitant. An elderly woman, dressed plainly, with a posture shaped by years of standing behind a counter, lifted herself from the bench. The court officer instinctively stepped forward, but she raised one hand politely. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady but soft, "I know this woman." Every head in the room turned. Even Helena's face registered surprise, quickly hardened into something between annoyance and fear. Judge Caprio motioned gently. "Ma'am, please state your name." But the woman didn't introduce herself yet. She kept her gaze on the judge. "She wasn't at any hospital this morning," the woman said. "She was at our gas station." The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. A few whispers fluttered but died quickly under the officer's stern glance. Helena spun toward the older woman. "You're lying," she barked, the gum between her teeth snapping sharply. "You don't know what you're talking about." But her voice had lost its earlier polish. Now it sounded ragged, frantic, too emotional for someone supposedly innocent. The judge raised a hand. "Mrs. Farrow, allow her to finish." The elderly woman nodded gratefully and continued. "She came in around 9 this morning, loud, upset, yelling at the young man behind the counter. He was trying to explain something to her, but she wouldn't let him speak." This was no longer a story about a parking ticket. It was a timeline, a witness account. And the discrepancy between 9 at a gas station and 9:40 at a disability space was already unraveling everything Helena had claimed. Helena shook her head hard, as though she could shake the words out of the air. "That's not what happened. She's exaggerating. She always does." But the older woman didn't even turn toward her. "I'm only telling what I saw," she said quietly. She wasn't rushing to a hospital. She was angry at the clerk, at everyone. The judge's face remained controlled, but his eyes sharpened, the way they did when a small case stopped being small. "Mrs. Farrow," he said, "this contradicts your statement." Her lips tightened. "You're taking her word over mine?" "I'm taking the facts as they come," he replied. A hollow pause followed, the kind that makes people shift in their seats without realizing it. And then the judge asked the question the entire room was already thinking. "Ma'am," he said to the elderly woman, "why were you at the gas station at that hour? Are you connected to this family's business?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, and what I need to explain will change how you see this morning." A collective breath drew in. Helena's fingers closed around her handbag so tightly the metal clasp clicked. Judge Caprio leaned forward. "Go on." The woman took a steadying breath, one that carried the weight of something much larger than a parking violation, and the courtroom braced for the truth that was about to shift the entire case. The elderly woman stepped closer to the microphone, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her voice, though soft, carried the kind of steadiness that only comes from years of speaking to impatient customers and hurried strangers. "My name is Martha Granger," she said, 72 years old. "I've worked at Farrow Fuel, one of the family stations, for 18 years. A ripple passed through the courtroom. Eyebrows lifted, bodies straightened. It wasn't every day that an employee of the defendant's own business appeared uninvited. Judge Caprio blinked once, taking that in. "So, you work for the Farrow family?" he clarified. Martha nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Helena's posture tightened, her chin tipping upward as if bracing for an attack. Martha continued, "And I was at the station this morning. I just finished my shift. I remember the time. It was 9:12 a.m. She paused, letting the timestamp settle. "Mrs. Farrow came in upset. She was yelling at the young man behind the counter, loud enough that I heard her from the back room. A murmur threaded through the benches. Helena shook her head quickly. This is ridiculous. You're exaggerating. I wasn't yelling. Martha didn't flinch. You raised your voice, more than once. Judge Caprio looked down at the citation time again, then back at Martha. That would place her at the station, 28 minutes before the fine was issued. Martha nodded once. The judge turned to Helena. That's quite a distance from the hospital you mentioned. Helena's silence said everything. Before she could craft a new explanation, Martha spoke again. This time slower, more deliberate. She wasn't angry about a delay or a mistake. The boy behind the counter, he was trying to tell her that her car was blocking a disability spot. The words hit harder than any accusation. A few people in the benches inhaled sharply. One woman lowered her eyes, shaking her head. Helena lifted her hand slightly, as if to push the statement away. That's not true. He misunderstood. But Martha interrupted softly, the way a grandmother might correct a child. No, he didn't misunderstand. He pointed at the sign. He tried to explain with gestures. The room went still. Judge Caprio's brows rose. Gestures? Martha's voice thinned with emotion now. Not anger, but something deeper, more fragile. He used gestures because he doesn't speak, Your Honor. She took a breath, steady but trembling at the edges. That young man, he's my grandson. The entire courtroom froze. Even Helena froze. A long, reverent silence followed, shock mixing with a sudden, sharp understanding. Martha continued, barely above a whisper. He has cerebral palsy. He can move. He can work a few hours. But communicating is difficult. He showed her the sign with his hand. He wasn't arguing. He was just trying to help. Helena's jaw slowly unclenched, her bravado draining like water through cracked stone. Her gaze dropped to the table. The judge exhaled, a quiet, weighty sound. Your grandson, he repeated, absorbing the revelation. Martha nodded again. Yes, sir. And that parking space, the one she took, is the only one he can safely use when his mother brings him in for therapy later in the day. Not a shout, not a condemnation, just truth, raw, ordinary, and devastating. Helena pressed her lips together, but they trembled despite her effort to look unmoved. Judge Caprio shifted forward, hands clasped. Mrs. Farrow, he said carefully, you heard what was just shared. Would you like to respond before we proceed? Helena opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. Nothing came out. The courtroom waited, not for drama, not for spectacle, but for the moment when the woman who mocked a $100 fine finally confronted what that fine represented. Her fingers tightened on the strap of her handbag, the metal buckle rattling softly. And for the first time all morning, she didn't look angry. She looked lost. The judge let the silence stretch, heavy but necessary, holding the room on the edge of what came next. Judge Caprio didn't speak right away. He let the weight of Martha's words settle over the courtroom like dust in a sunbeam. No outrage, no lecturing, just a long, discerning silence. When he finally addressed Helena, his tone had changed. No sharper, but deeper, carrying the calm authority of someone who has watched thousands of people crumble or redeem themselves at that very microphone. Mrs. Farrow, he began, I've heard every excuse imaginable. Traffic, emergencies, lost track of time. But what you've told me today, what you haven't told me, matters far more than a citation. His voice wasn't accusing, but it carried a quiet gravity that made Helena lift her head despite herself. Why, he continued, have you been hiding the truth? Her jaw trembled. ever so slightly. She blinked quickly, as if trying to steady something inside her before it spilled out. "I wasn't hiding," she said, but the sentence collapsed under its own weight. She tried again. "I just didn't want to talk about it here, in front of everyone." The bravado that had filled the room earlier was gone. No gum clicking, no dismissive smirk. Just a woman stripped of her armor. "My husband is in the hospital," she said finally. "He's been there all week. He had complications after a procedure, and the doctors—" Her voice faltered. She steadied it. "I've been trying to keep the business running. I've been meeting with accountants, lawyers, people who want answers I don't have." She swallowed hard. "And when I went into the station this morning and that boy—" She caught herself. "Your grandson. When he tried to signal at me, I snapped. I shouldn't have. I know that." Her words weren't polished. They didn't sound like something crafted for sympathy. They came out with the uneven rhythm of someone trying to make sense of their own behavior while saying it out loud for the first time. The judge listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "I'm sorry for what you're going through," he said. "Illness in a family takes a toll on everyone. And I imagine the pressure of running a business on top of that only magnifies the strain." She looked down, ashamed. Not because he scolded her, but because he didn't. "But," he continued gently, "stress does not give any of us permission to diminish another person's dignity, especially someone already carrying more burdens than most." His eyes shifted to Martha. "I believe what you've said today, and I appreciate the courage it took to speak." Martha lowered her gaze slightly, humbly. Before the judge could go on, Martha added something unexpected, something that turned the room again. "Your Honor, my grandson wasn't arguing with her. He can't. He doesn't speak. He only pointed to the sign, because that was the only way he knew to communicate." The statement landed with a quiet, devastating impact. Helena closed her eyes, not dramatically, not seeking sympathy. Just a single, instinctive gesture of someone who had not understood the full picture until it was far too late. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know he couldn't talk. I thought he was just... I thought..." She stopped, unable to finish. For the first time, the courtroom didn't see arrogance or entitlement. They saw a woman overwhelmed by her own choices, realizing how deeply they'd hurt someone who couldn't defend himself. Martha, surprisingly, softened. "Mrs. Farrow," she said quietly, "I know you're under strain. We all lose our tempers. But my grandson wasn't trying to make your day harder. He just didn't want someone else to take the space he needs." Helena lifted her eyes, red-rimmed but dry. "I was wrong," she said, almost inaudibly. "I was completely wrong, and I'm sorry." No theatrics, no flourishes, a small, unguarded admission. A sigh moved through the audience, not judgmental this time, but relieved, like people witnessing the moment a storm breaks and the air finally clears. Judge Caprio nodded once. "Thank you, Mrs. Farrow." And for the first time all morning, her shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in acceptance. The tension in the courtroom settled into something quieter, something fragile. What came next wouldn't be punishment. It would be the lesson she clearly needed, and the one everyone in the room was waiting to hear. Judge Caprio folded his hands, the file still open but untouched, as if the paperwork mattered less now than the moment itself. He spoke with a gentleness that carried further than any stern command. "Mrs. Farrow," he began, "I'm not here to make your life harder. I'm here to restore balance when it's been shaken." She lifted her gaze, bracing as though expecting a harsher judgment than she deserved. "But increasing your fine won't help your husband," he continued. "It won't ease your burdens, and it won't undo what happened this morning. A beat of silence passed. That's why, he said softly, I will not raise the penalty beyond the scheduled amount. A rustle moved through the room. Surprise, not disapproval. It wasn't leniency for privilege. It was discernment. But, he added, I'm assigning a requirement. Helena straightened. You will pay the $100 as a donation to the rehabilitation center your employee's grandson attends. He paused, letting the words land. Or, if you prefer, you may visit the center instead, meet the staff, and see the work they do. Helena blinked, stunned. She seemed almost unsure whether this was mercy or responsibility, or both. The judge continued. What happened today wasn't just about a parking spot. It was about seeing the people around us. Really seeing them. The courtroom, which had buzzed earlier with tension and whispers, quieted into a stillness that felt almost reverent. Helena drew in a slow breath and nodded. I'll go, she said, to the center. Her voice carried no bravado now, only sincerity and a new weight of accountability. No applause followed, no murmurs of triumph, just a silence filled with understanding. As she stepped away from the microphone, Martha, still near the aisle, cleared her throat softly. Mrs. Farrow, she said. Helena paused. Martha offered a small, cautious smile. If you'd like, I can show you where my grandson does his therapy. It's not a sad place. It's where he works very hard. The invitation surprised everyone, even the judge. In a case fueled by conflict, this was the one gesture no one predicted. Helena hesitated only a moment. I'd appreciate that. The two women regarded each other, not as opponents, not as employer and employee, but as people caught in the frailty of circumstance. Something in their postures softened, as though the distance between them, built from pride, fear, misunderstanding, finally thinned. Judge Caprio rose slightly, resting his palms on the bench. Before you go, he said, looking not just at them, but at everyone present, remember this. Respect isn't measured in money. It's measured in choices. And every day, each of us gets another chance to choose better. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The clerk announced the next case, but for a moment, no one moved. The atmosphere had changed. The way a room feels different after a truth has been spoken aloud. Helena picked up her handbag carefully, almost reverently this time, as if aware of how much weight it had carried earlier. Martha stepped beside her, not touching her, but close enough to guide her toward the aisle. They exited together through the same doorway Helena had entered with so much noise and dismissal. Now her steps were quieter, still measured but humbled, purposeful. As the door swung gently shut behind them, the courtroom returned to its rhythm. Yet something lingered in the air, a softened edge, a reminder. People don't just need judgment. Sometimes they need direction. And for those who listened closely, the morning had offered exactly that.